He walked into the studio ready to tear her down, to make a spectacle of her on live television. But by the time Karoline Leavitt was finished, the entire room sat in stunned silence. Karoline wasn't new to interviews. She had faced difficult questions before, debated opponents who tried to corner her, and stood her ground when people attempted to rattle her. But something about this interview felt different. She had first heard about it a week ago, an invitation from a well-known news program. Not just any show, but one infamous for its aggressive and confrontational style. This wasn't the kind of place where guests were merely questioned. They were put on the spot, pushed into defensive positions, and often ridiculed. The host, Richard Caldwell, was a veteran journalist with decades of experience. His reputation was built on sharp questioning, an unforgiving attitude, and a tendency to belittle younger guests, especially those who didn't align with his views. Karoline knew what she was walking into. She had done her research. Caldwell had made a name for himself by exposing people he believed were unqualified or unprepared. His strategy was simple: provoke, discredit, and, if necessary, humiliate. He didn't invite people on his show for honest discussions. He brought them on to assert control. And tonight, his target was Karoline. Even before she stepped into the studio, she could already hear the criticisms: too young, too inexperienced, too ambitious. These labels didn't bother her. What did irritate her was the arrogance of men like Caldwell, who thought they could shake her confidence with a smirk and a raised eyebrow. The moment she arrived, she felt the tension. The producer, a middle-aged man, greeted her with a polite but hollow smile. The assistant, younger woman, gave her a hesitant nod but avoided eye contact. The message was clear. No one expected her to hold her own against Caldwell. But Karoline had no intention of playing into their expectations. As she sat in the makeup chair, the stylist dusted powder over her face, barely making small talk. In the background, she could hear the faint voices from the adjacent set. Caldwell was finishing his previous segment. His voice was steady, confident, the tone of a man who had controlled countless conversations before. The stylist adjusted the collar of Karoline's blazer. "You ready?" she asked. Karoline met her own reflection in the mirror. She didn't need to answer. She was more than ready. Minutes later, she walked onto the set. The lights were harsh, the air conditioning made the room feel colder than necessary, and the audience, composed mostly of journalists and industry insiders, watched in silence, waiting. Caldwell was already seated, legs crossed, wearing a knowing smirk. It wasn't a friendly smile, it was a challenge. His fingers tapped lightly on the desk as she sat down. "Karoline Leavitt," he said, stretching out her name as if tasting it. "Welcome to the show." She nodded. "Thanks for having me." His eyes scanned her, assessing her like a boxer sizing up an opponent before the first round. Then he leaned forward, the smirk deepening. "You've made quite a name for yourself in a short time," he said. "Some might say too fast for someone with so little experience." Karoline had been expecting this. It was a veiled insult dressed as an observation, an attempt to plant doubt right from the start. She didn't blink. "I believe experience comes from action, not just from the number of years spent doing something," she said, her voice steady. Caldwell chuckled, shaking his head as if amused. But isn't that what every young upstart says before realizing they're in over their head?" There it was, the first attempt to make her doubt herself, to see if she would falter. But she didn't. Caldwell continued, tilting his head in mock curiosity. "I have to ask, do you truly believe you've earned a seat at this table? Or is this just another case of someone trying to skip the hard work and go straight for the spotlight?" The atmosphere in the studio shifted. It was clear this wouldn't be a simple conversation. It was going to be a battle. But Karoline had never been one to back down from a fight. She straightened in her chair, meeting his gaze without hesitation. I don't believe success has a set timeline, she said. If someone is competent, prepared, and driven, why should they have to wait their turn? Caldwell smirked again, but there was a flicker of something else in his expression, mild surprise. He had expected a rehearsed answer, something easy to dismiss. Instead, she had given him something he couldn't immediately refute. That's the thing about younger generations, he said, shaking his head. Always in a rush. You talk about preparation, but let's be honest, experience matters. Many would argue that you haven't paid your dues. A faint chuckle came from someone off camera. They were waiting for her to stumble. She didn't. The idea of paying dues is often used to keep people in their place, she said. What exactly are we talking about? A waiting period? A certain number of years before someone's opinion is valid? I don't think the world works that way anymore. Caldwell's smirk twitched. She had caught him off guard. He leaned forward. All right, let's talk about credibility. Some say it's too easy these days to gain a following without actually knowing what you're talking about. Social media amplifies voices that, in past generations, might have been ignored for good reason. A murmur rippled through the audience. They were engaged now. Karoline remained calm. She saw where he was trying to take this. He wanted to paint her as a product of the digital age, someone who hadn't truly earned her influence. I find it funny, she said, how people in power always make that argument right up until someone younger outperforms them. Then suddenly, it's not about skill or results anymore. It's about credibility. The goalposts move. Caldwell's smirk remained, but now it looked forced. So you're saying expertise doesn't matter? He challenged. Not at all, she replied smoothly. I'm saying expertise isn't exclusive to people who have been doing the same thing, the same way, for decades. Sometimes the ones asking new questions are the ones actually pushing things forward. Caldwell exhaled through his nose, adjusting his posture. His usual tactics weren't working, and he knew it. So, he said, shifting gears, you believe results speak louder than time served? Karoline met his gaze. I think people trust results, she said. When someone is effective, when they produce meaningful work, people notice. That's true whether you've been in the game for 2 years or 20. Caldwell let out a sharp breath, somewhere between a laugh and a scoff. Public attention doesn't always mean quality. Absolutely, she agreed. But if someone remains relevant, if people consistently seek their insight, if their work stands the test of time, then that's real credibility. The corners of Caldwell's mouth twitched. He wasn't smiling anymore. He had expected her to falter, to flounder under pressure. But instead, she had flipped the script. She wasn't playing defense. She wasn't backing down. And now, for the first time in a long time, Richard Caldwell was the one struggling to control the conversation. Karoline sat across from Caldwell, meeting his gaze with calm confidence. He exhaled through his nose, nodding slightly. Then let's really test that resilience, he said. The conversation had shifted. This wasn't just a debate anymore, it was a challenge. Caldwell had been waiting for this moment, holding on to his next move like a card he had been saving. But Karoline wasn't just holding her ground now, she was taking control. And Caldwell knew it. He adjusted his posture, planting both elbows on the desk. The smug amusement from earlier was gone. Now, his expression was cold and calculating. He was preparing to strike harder. All right, he said, his voice steady. Since you're so confident in your credibility, let's talk about why some people question it. Karoline didn't rush to respond. She knew better than to walk into a trap without seeing the full picture first. Caldwell didn't wait. He pulled a sheet of paper from the stack in front of him, using it as a prop to make his next words seem like an undeniable fact, rather than an opinion. He glanced at it, then looked back at her. You've been accused of pushing narratives that fit your personal views instead of sticking strictly to the facts. Some critics even claim you ignore certain details because they don't support your perspective. Would you say that's a fair criticism? Karoline didn't blink. She could see what he was trying to do, paint her as dishonest, manipulative. This wasn't just about her qualifications anymore. Now, he was attacking her integrity. She tilted her head slightly. That's an easy accusation to throw around when someone doesn't like what I have to say? Caldwell raised an eyebrow as if amused. So, you're saying your critics just don't like you? No, Karoline replied. I'm saying that when people can't argue against the substance of what I say, they attack the person instead. It's a classic deflection tactic. Caldwell let out a slow breath. A deflection tactic? He repeated. So when people claim you've ignored inconvenient facts, they're just making it up? Karoline leaned forward slightly. Every discussion has different angles. I focus on the parts most relevant to my point just like you do, just like every journalist does. That's not deception, that's framing. If someone thinks I left something out, they're free to bring it up and I'll address it. Caldwell's fingers curled slightly against the paper. He expected her to scramble for a defense, but she wasn't backing down. He tried again. All right, but let's go beyond framing. You've built a platform on confidence on the idea that you have answers. But what happens when you're wrong? Have you ever admitted to making a mistake? His tone was careful. He wanted her to hesitate, to falter even for a moment. But Karoline didn't. Of course, she said easily. I've been wrong before. That's part of learning. But here's the difference: when I realize I'm wrong, I don't double down to save face. I correct it and move forward. Caldwell's jaw tightened just slightly before he forced another smirk. And yet, some people say you never acknowledge your mistakes. Karoline smiled just a little. Some people say a lot of things, she said. That doesn't make them true. The audience chuckled, not at her but at him. The balance of the conversation had shifted again, and he could feel it. He tapped the paper against the desk, exhaling. He wasn't out of moves yet, but Karoline could see the frustration building beneath the surface. Let's get this straight, he said. You're young. You're outspoken. You challenge conventional wisdom. And yet, you think none of the criticism against you is valid? Karoline shook her head. That's not what I said. I think criticism is valuable, but not all criticism is honest. Some people don't like perspectives that challenge their own. Caldwell opened his mouth, but she kept going. Let's be real, she added. People in your position have spent years deciding who gets taken seriously and who doesn't. So when someone like me comes along, someone who doesn't wait for permission, who doesn't follow the old rules, you call it a lack of credibility. But what you're really upset about is losing control of the conversation. A few people in the audience murmured. Caldwell's jaw shifted. She had hit a nerve. But instead of backing down, he forced another tight smile. He had one last move. Then let's talk about control, he said. Because right now, you're sitting in a seat that a lot of people don't think you deserve. And I have to ask, what happens when they're right? The studio fell silent. It was a direct challenge, his final push to shake her. But Karoline had never been more steady. She met his gaze, unwavering. That's the real question, isn't it? She said. Not whether I'm competent, not whether my arguments hold up, but whether I deserve to be here. That's what this has been about from the start. Caldwell leaned in slightly. Exactly. Because there's a difference between being loud and being qualified, between being popular and actually earning respect. Karoline exhaled through her nose, a short breath note. Frustration, but something close to amusement. She wasn't rattled. If anything, she looked stronger. "Respect isn't given, Richard," she said. "It's taken." The weight of those 3 words landed. Even Caldwell's smirk faltered for a split second before he recovered. Karoline continued, her voice unwavering. "You talk about qualifications, but let's be honest, many people in power didn't earn their positions. They were born into the right family, knew the right people, said the right things to the right audience. And you never questioned if they deserved to be there. But when someone like me, who built their own platform, comes along suddenly, it's about qualifications." Caldwell crossed his arms. "So, you think you're above criticism?" "No," Karoline answered immediately. "I think criticism should be fair. The truth is, people like me are held to a different standard. We have to be twice as sharp, twice as prepared, just to get half the respect. And when we prove ourselves, the goalposts move." Caldwell's jaw tensed. Karoline didn't stop. "You call it arrogance," she said. "I call it not waiting for permission to sit at a table that was never built for me." A murmur ran through the audience. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a reckoning. Caldwell exhaled, rolling his shoulders back. "That's a strong answer," he admitted. "But confidence isn't proof. If you're wrong, are you willing to admit it?" She gave a small nod. "Absolutely. But being questioned by people who've already made up their minds about me isn't the same as being wrong." For the first time, Caldwell had nothing to say. Silence filled the studio. The shift was undeniable. Karoline watched him, waiting. No smirk. No comeback. Just silence. The cameras captured it all. Finally, Caldwell let out a slow breath. He glanced at his notes, flipped a page, then set them down. He knew it. Karoline knew it. She had won. "Well," he said, forcing control into his voice, "that's certainly one way to look at it." Karoline just smiled. And everyone watching knew the truth. This wasn't just an interview. This was a statement.